let's take a look at who's on top. The win in the happiness stakes goes to the Nordic countries again. Finland, Denmark, Iceland, not sure if it's officially Nordic or not, but we'll call them that, and Sweden. Moving up, Mexico and Costa Rica are rising on the charts to 8 and 10 respectively.
Fascinating. So people are not vibing on America these days.
No.
Yeah, this tends to be a trend. So I am looking at this list and I'm thinking, you know, what's at the top? We got Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, Israel. There's something that they all have in common, which there is social safety nets and there's sort of a robust social welfare state. There's high tax. Everybody loves to talk about it. High taxes, high amounts of services. So there's sort of a feeling, a baseline level of security in those societies. There is also a relatively more intact system of people having children, getting married, underneath the age of 35. That's particularly the case in Israel. There's children everywhere. But I'll tell you what I think unites the people at the top. Adverse conditions. A lot of these nations are frigid, cold, rough to live in. It's not all about sunshine, warmth, and good vibes and the environment you're in. There's a culture within the people of all these countries of going through a kind of struggle together and a gratitude for the things that are good despite living in challenging places. And this has a lot to do with how people actually think of and process their own degrees of happiness. Is what are they grateful for? It plays a big role. And you know, U.S., very free, very prosperous. I would never say that we are a super gracious country. I think we always want more, more, more.
So that's an interesting theory or thesis. The issue of prosperity and adversity, though, is interesting because there are an enormous number of Americans who face very serious adversity in their lives, materially and otherwise. A lot of people struggling with cost of living and all of that. Now, it is true that most Americans are vastly better off than most people in the most benighted regions of the world. But I wonder, to your point, whether the inequalities of American life actually tear at that kind of fabric of unity or satisfaction or commonality that you're alluding to in those other countries.
I mean, I don't know if inequalities in America fuel that, but I will say that we are a country that is very much driven towards accumulation. It's the capitalist mindset of this country to rise, to succeed, to grow your income, and as a result, in capitalist societies, you do have a lot of bifurcation between the people who have a lot and the people who have very little. And that hunger for the American dream, though, is a big part of why people come here. There's a spirit here of not settling for a baseline. I've got some friends in Britain, and there's just this very interesting culture there of when people rise beyond their station, it's like they've committed a taboo and they've exceeded where they came from as a child. And,
This is a complete tangent, but it does somewhat go to that point. When I first came to this country, I was accustomed to the default answer when someone asks you in Ireland or Britain, how are you? The default answer is not bad. And when Americans would ask me that question and I would say not bad, they would look at me with great concern as to how things were. What is that all? And so I have had to get accustomed to the American tendency to say things are great, they're fantastic, which if you said in Ireland or Britain, you would be regarded, I think, as tooting your own horn to an excessive degree or being a little bit too happy.
That is so interesting. So one of the people that I read a lot on this issue is Arthur Brooks of Harvard University. He recently did one of his newest books with Oprah that has a lot to do with happiness, and he also has a New York Times column on happiness. And you know, he dives into how people even respond to that word. When you ask someone to report their levels of happiness, they are responding to you with a read of their feelings. And Arthur Brooks, you know, who is a researcher with deep knowledge on this issue, wants to remind that happiness is best not thought of as a feeling. It is a journey. It is a place that you are trying to get to every day, but it's not necessarily a real destination. We tend to think of happiness as an immediate feeling, but it's more of an indicator that there are good things going on in our lives. He once described it as happiness is when you smell good food cooking in the kitchen, but it is the evidence that something is in the kitchen that is good in your life. And so kind of to build that out, and he breaks it down into 3 pillars. You have to have enjoyment in your life. That is things like maybe eating with people, right? Having meals with people you care about. Satisfaction. And satisfaction often comes from the struggle. And then the other thing is meaning. So understanding your purpose and your place in the world. And his research has showed that if you're missing one of those 3 things, you take an immediate 30% hit on your reported levels of happiness. You have to have your foot in all 3 of those pillars to report yourself as being relatively happy. And Americans struggle with meaning, satisfaction, and enjoyment.
I think that firstly, that's really interesting in and of itself. And I also think it links back to where we began when we were introducing this segment about the idea of disconnection and an increasingly solitary society or disconnected society. And I think, there are 50 or 100 or 1,000 reasons that we could give for that, and people of a more conservative disposition, I think, would often talk about the loosening of community bonds of churches, for example, declining church membership. I think people of a more liberal disposition might think of things like the fact that in a previous generation it was comparatively easier for families on one income to survive and thrive, and now often you have, even if you have a 2-parent family, you have parents who are obligated to work very, very long hours. That in itself causes a sort of fraying of those familial situations, and obviously in 1-parent families that becomes even more severe. So it's a fascinating topic.
And I might try to tie 2 things together here, because you mentioned sort of how conservatives tend to think of this issue, and even when I was looking over this index, my first gut instinct was, what are the fertility rates in these countries? How often are they having children? How many? There's no South Korea on these rankings at all, and we all know about the population problems they're having. But there is a connection between family formation and children and reported degrees of happiness, but that is tied in many ways to sacrifice of the things that American culture tells you are going to make you most happy, which is achievement, making more money, free time, going on things like vacations. And I'm going to tie this to something else, which is a very famous book by Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, psychologist, and he wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And the entire thing is this wonderful essay on how people find meaning in their lives despite suffering, hard conditions. And at the end of the book, a student asks him, what is the meaning to life? And his answer for that is the meaning of my life, I believe, is to help other people find the meaning of theirs. And so we have a problem in our country with too much self-focus. Liberals might say selfishness. So concern with everything that's going on with you, and having children is an element of that. You start caring a lot less about your wants, your needs, your dreams when you're focused on building the wants and needs of somebody else. And that is, I think, the underlying problem here that we might be seeing. There's a lot of social cohesion in those Nordic countries and in places like Iceland, and hard conditions, but they sort of believe that they're doing it together and that it is something that you do without complaining.
Yeah, and I think that kind of collective mindset has real benefits, as you say, in terms of social cohesion and in terms of making it a little easier for people to find some meaning in life.
Yeah, even as a libertarian, I have qualms with radical individualism. We need each other. We need community. It's good to know your neighbors, and it's fine if you want to go have a house out in the country and build a life there, but you're going to be judged over time based on, not judged, but you're going to derive a sense of connection to the world around you based on how many people you know and who shows up at your Thanksgiving dinner and eventually your funeral. And right now, I think a lot of people are missing that.